Now, furious scenes as MPs and peers return. Today, in Parliament.
Order! Order! Good evening. This is Sean Curran at Westminster.
Colleagues, welcome back to our place of work.
And so began a day of high drama and emotion following the Supreme Court's judgment that the Prime Minister's decision to prorogue or suspend Parliament for 5 weeks had been unlawful. Boris Johnson was unapologetic when he appeared before MPs this evening.
It is absolutely no disrespect to the judiciary to say I think the court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question.
The Prime Minister spent most of his statement trying to goad the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, into proposing a vote of no confidence in the government, which could lead to a general election.
Out of sheer selfishness and political cowardice, members opposite are unwilling to move aside and give the people a say.
Boris Johnson offered to break with convention and allow parliamentary time for a vote on a motion of no confidence tabled by the smaller opposition parties.
Will they refuse to take responsibility and do nothing but dither and delay? Why wouldn't they? What are they scared of?
The Prime Minister said it was time to get Brexit done and move on.
This Parliament must either stand aside and let this government get Brexit done, or bring a vote of confidence and finally face the day of reckoning with the voters. And I commend this statement to the House.
The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, dismissed the statement as 10 minutes of bluster.
From a dangerous Prime Minister who thinks he is above the law. But in truth, Mr. Speaker, is not fit for the office which he holds.
He said the decision by the Supreme Court represented an extraordinary and precarious moment in the country's history.
The judges concluded there was no reason, and I quote, let alone a good reason, for the Prime Minister to have shut down Parliament. After yesterday's ruling, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should have done the honourable thing and resigned.
Jeremy Corbyn said no one could trust the Prime Minister and he should go for the good of the country.
He says he wants a general election. I want a general election. It's very simple. If he wants an election, get an extension and let's have an election.
At the start of this month, MPs changed the law to force the Prime Minister to ask for a delay in the UK's departure from the European Union if a Brexit deal hasn't been agreed by the 19th of October. Boris Johnson mocked Jeremy Corbyn's position on Brexit.
He can't decide whether he's for leave or for remain. He's being held captive by his colleagues. The electorate are being held captive by this zombie parliament and this zombie opposition. And he wants the entire country to be held captive in the EU after October the 31st at a cost of more than £1 billion a month. We say no. I say no. Let's get Brexit done and let's take this country forward.
That applause from some Conservatives went on for some time. The leader of the SNP at Westminster, Ian Blackford, called on the Prime Minister to show some respect for the judiciary in the wake of the Supreme Court's judgment. And he said Boris Johnson's position was no longer tenable.
People across these countries will be reading today about how the Prime Minister fought the law, but the law won. The Prime Minister, the head of government, who is responsible for the law, responsible for governance. What an example to the public. Let me be clear to the Prime Minister that he should resign. But if he fails to do so, yes, the opposition must unite to trigger a vote of no confidence to bring this chaotic government down.
The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Joe Swinson, said the Prime Minister needed to understand that actions had consequences.
Surely the Prime Minister can have the humility to say sorry for misleading the Queen, misleading the country and illegally shutting down our democracy.
Prime Minister! Well, Mr. Speaker, I think, quite frankly, one of the actions for which the Right Honourable Lady might wish to take responsibility was writing to the President of the European Commission, actively encouraging him not to do a deal with this country.
The leader of the DUP at Westminster, Nigel Dodds, said the fundamentals of Brexit remained unchanged. The government needed to deliver the result of the 2016 referendum, ideally with a deal.
All the shenanigans in this House undermining the leverage of the Prime Minister is actually in danger of bringing about the very result that some who say they don't want a no deal will actually achieve.
The Conservative former Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, praised the patriotism of people who'd voted to remain in the EU and then accepted the result of the referendum.
The general public never doubted that we in this place would act on their wishes. That is the trust that they had, and I think still have, in all of us here and this Parliament. Does my right honourable friend agree that when people trust you in this way, you do not let them down?
Boris Johnson spent more than 3 hours at the dispatch box. Throughout the exchanges, the Prime Minister called the plans to stop the UK leaving the EU without a deal the surrender bill. Emotions were already running high when he was challenged by a Labour MP, Paula Sherriff, who referred to the Labour MP Joe Cox, who was murdered in June 2016.
We stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: surrender act, betrayal, traitor, and I, for one, am sick of it. We must moderate our language, and it has to come from the Prime Minister first. So I would be interested in hearing his opinion. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
I think, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life.
That prompted protests from Labour MPs, and there was more anger a few minutes later when Boris Johnson suggested that the best way to honour Joe Cox would be to, quote, get Brexit done. Well, the bad-tempered tone had been set much earlier in the day when the Attorney-General, Geoffrey told MPs Parliament was dead. He accused the opposition of being scared of a general election. He, in turn, was accused of lacking shame following the Supreme Court's decision. Christina Cooper reports.
Despite having his legal advice comprehensively picked apart by 11 judges, Geoffrey Cox sounded pretty upbeat.
If every time I lost a case, I was called upon to resign, I probably would never have had a practice.
The Attorney-General is under pressure to break with convention and publish his legal advice. Mr Cox revealed that he was considering whether it might be in the public interest to do so. He was in the Commons to answer an urgent question from the SNP MP Joanna Cherry, one of the leading figures in the legal battle on prorogation.
Let me start by assuring the Attorney-General that I'm not going to call for his resignation yet.
Documents revealing some of Mr Cox's legal advice have been leaked to the media. Reports said he had considered prorogation to be lawful and said that anyone who disagreed was politically motivated. Ms Cherry wondered about the motive behind the leak.
Many of us believe that the Attorney-General is being offered up as a fall guy for the Prime Minister's botched plans. So does he not agree with me that to release the advice in its entirety will help him avoid being the scapegoat for a plan that was dreamed up by the Prime Minister and his advisers?
Mr Cox couldn't promise to publish the documents, but he thanked Joanna Cherry.
I'm extremely grateful for the Honourable Lady's solicitousness and kindness for my welfare.
There was no sign of kindness, however, from Labour's Shadow Solicitor General, Nick Thomas-Symonds.
On this Attorney-General's watch,
The government has been found in contempt of Parliament. Now it has been found in contempt of the law. Incredible. Doesn't he just accept he hasn't got a shred of credibility left?
Those comments seem to cast a shadow over Mr Cox's mood.
I don't know whether, in his practice, when he was at the bar, he felt that just because he'd given advice that might not have been upheld by a court, he had no credibility. That is an absurd and ridiculous proposition.
And he insisted his advice had been sound advice at the time.
The court of last resort ultimately disagreed with it. But in doing so, they made new law, as they were entirely entitled to do.
It's been reported that the leader of the Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has called the Supreme Court decision a constitutional coup. Labour's Angela Eagle wondered if Mr Cox agreed.
Surely he cannot remain in his post if he has that view.
There is nothing wrong with expressing robust, critical views about a judgment.
Rory Stewart, now an independent MP, didn't think there was anything new about the Supreme Court judgment. It had been asserting the ancient sovereignty of Parliament.
It is for this House, the only directly elected representatives of the people, to determine the form in which that Brexit happens.
Mr Cox is renowned for his deep, booming voice, and in answering Mr Stewart, he deployed it to full effect, declaring that the Commons had rejected both the Brexit deal and no deal.
This Parliament is a dead Parliament. It should no longer sit. It has no moral right to sit on these green benches, and whatever.
His remarks caused uproar on the opposition benches, but Mr Cox pushed on, criticising Labour for refusing to back a general election.
This Parliament should have the courage to face the electorate. But it won't. It won't, because so many of them are really all about preventing us leaving the European Union at all. But the time is coming. The time is coming, Mr. Speaker, when even these turkeys won't be able to prevent Christmas.
His remarks infuriated Labour MPs, especially Barry Shearman.
Every word he has uttered. No shame today, no shame at all. The fact that this government cynically manipulated the prorogation to shut down this House so that it couldn't work as a democratic assembly. He knows that that is the truth. And to come here with these barristers' bluster to obfuscate the truth, and for a man like him, a party like this, and a leader like this Prime Minister, to talk about morals and morality is a disgrace!
Mr Cox dismissed his remarks as a marshmallow of rhetoric, suggesting that if he wanted to get rid of the government, he should get Jeremy Corbyn to agree to a general election.
Christina Cooper. You're listening to Today in Parliament on BBC Radio 4 with me, Sean Curran. So, Parliament is back up and running, but what are MPs going to be debating in the coming days? Just after 10 o'clock this evening, the Leader of the Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, made a short statement about Thursday's business.
A motion to approve a conference adjournment motion for next week, followed by a general debate on the principles of democracy and the rights of the electorate.
That means the government is going to ask MPs to agree that the Commons doesn't sit during the Conservative conference next week. Labour's shadow leader of the Commons, Valerie Vaz, seemed to be taking a benevolent approach.
We stand ready to work with the government to ensure that the Tory party conference takes place in the fantastic Labour-led city of Manchester. It is surely possible for the leader to schedule important legislation that commands widespread support across the House.
Jacob Rees-Mogg wondered whether it would be really wise for his party to go off to Manchester and leave even uncontentious legislation in the hands of the Commons. But the SNP's Pete Wishart made it clear his party wouldn't support plans for a non-sitting week.
It's a party that is never, ever covered by the so-called conference recess. And can I remind the Leader of the House, the Queen's speech that he had scheduled was the first full day of our conference. Can I tell him, he can, with all due respect, he can go and stuff that notion where his top hat don't shine.
Pete Wishart. Well, prorogation wasn't the only issue that caused anger today. MPs expressed their fury over the collapse of the travel company Thomas Cook. Several criticised the government for not bailing out the firm, while others demanded an investigation into the conduct of its directors. Mandy Baker reports.
The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said the collapse of Thomas Cook had left 150,000 people stranded in 50 countries, and it would take 1,000 flights to get them all home.
We've never had the collapse of an airline or a holiday company on this scale before. We've responded swiftly and decisively. Right now, our efforts are rightly focused on getting those passengers home and looking after those employees who have lost their jobs.
Many MPs, such as the SNP's Ronnie Cowan, told of constituents in distress.
I have two constituents who are stuck in Mexico. They were told they were on a flight. When they turned up for it, they were told they weren't. They face the real possibility of no accommodation, no flights. They're tired, they're anxious, they're running out of money.
Grant Shapps said such tales were hugely distressing.
But every effort is being made to bring them home, and I hope he will understand that hiring 45 aircraft when the MAX 737 is out of commission and therefore the market is restricted has meant that this is an enormous project, which has meant that sometimes we've had the wrong size aircraft for the number of passengers there.
A Conservative, Vicky Ford, was worried about Thomas Cook customers in a different position.
What assistance is there likely to be for people who have bought flights or holidays that haven't yet started?
The minister said they should be able to get a refund under the ATOL scheme or through credit or debit cards or from their travel insurance. But several MPs wanted to know why the government didn't save Thomas Cook. This was Labour's Liz McInnes.
Surely it would be better for British business if Thomas Cook had been bailed out rather than spending millions of pounds on repatriating holidaymakers.
Grant Shapps said the business was in a perilous state and it would have been throwing good money after bad.
Any rational person, including, incidentally, the accounting officers throughout government, would have looked at this deal and refused to sign off such a payment.
But a Lib Dem, Luciana Berger, pointed out that we've been here before. 2 years ago, Monarch Airlines collapsed and a similar repatriation operation was mounted. She quoted what the Transport Secretary had just said.
These are the exact same words given in response to the collapse of Monarch in October 2017 by his predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Epsom and Ewell.
That's Chris Grayling. Grant Shapps himself said it was a ridiculous situation that a repatriation operation such as this was needed for Thomas Cook.